Venture X card from Capital One gives you premium travel benefits, perfect for seeing Taylor Swift The Eras Tour. Presented by Capital One. Oh, I do love her. Earn 5 times miles on flights and 10 times miles on hotels through Capital One Travel.
Enjoy your stay in Suite 13.
Whoa, 13? That's Taylor's lucky number. The Venture X card from Capital One. What's in your wallet?
Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com for details.
Hey, it's Mistress Carrie, reporting for duty from MCHQ for episode 63 of the Mistress Carrie podcast. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Digital Federal Credit Union, better known by all of us as just DCU. And whether you're driving off the lot or you're refinancing, DCU can help you save on your next auto loan with rates as low as 1.49% APR. Now is the perfect time to upgrade your ride before winter, and DCU can help you save. You heard me, rates as low as 1.49% APR. You can learn more at dcu.org/auto. Insured by the NCUA, membership required. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by Jumptown Skydiving. If you have always wanted to jump out of a plane just one time and get that off your bucket list, you may as well do it at America's oldest skydiving drop zone. Jumptown is conveniently located right off of Route 2 in Orange, Massachusetts, and they're open 7 days a week. But Jumptown also understands that service industry employees can't always make plans with all of their friends on the weekends. That's why they offer service industry discounts on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. Discounted tandem jumps as low as $185. So why not put a group together from work and head out to Jumptown to make a skydive? If you organize the group, you get $10 off of your jump for every person you bring. Bring 10 people and your skydive is free. Climb up to 13,500 feet in the air and jump out of that plane. Log on to jumptown.com for the details, or to make your reservation, call 978-544-5321. Okay, episode 63 of the Mistress Carrie podcast checks off something off of my bucket list. Nancy Wilson from Heart, in my opinion, is part of the Mount Rushmore of women in rock. Her and her sister Ann together broke boundaries and kicked the door open for women in rock and roll with their band Heart. Sure, there have been many influential women in rock, going back to the blues in the 40s, and Janis and Joan Jett and Stevie Nicks and Pat Benatar and so on. But Ann and Nancy Wilson were always different. Nancy also had to earn the respect of being a guitar player, and she has. Nancy just released her first ever solo album, which is called You and Me. She's collaborating with the Seattle Symphony Orchestra. She's continuing her career working in film and television scoring. And there's even rumors, which she talks about in this episode, of a movie based on her and her sister's lives and the band. Nancy and I talked about her and Ann's upbringing, their love of music, starting Heart, learning how to play the guitar, influences, songwriting, the role of women in music and how that's changed and evolved, and so much more. Every once in a while, you're going to hear a little technical issue. We never really solved what was going on with her internet connection. But getting a chance to spend this much one-on-one time with Nancy Wilson was a dream come true, and she was everything that I thought she would be. She was generous, forthcoming, open. She has a great sense of humor. And above all else, she's a motherfucking rock and roll badass. So allow me to introduce you to Nancy Wilson from Heart.
Hey, what's up? This is Sully from Godsmack. Strap on those boots, baby, because you are now in the trenches of the war room with the one and only Mistress Carrie right here on the Mistress Carrie podcast.
What's up? This is Joe Rogan, and you're listening to Mistress Carrie.
Her hair so lovely, pretty eyes.
Hey, this is Brent from Shinedown, and you're listening to Mistress Carrie. Hey, Carrie, go put your brow on, girl.
Hey, this is Steven Tyler, and you be listening to the baddest bitch in Boston, Mistress Carrie.
What's up? This is Aaron from Stain, and you're listening to Mistress Carrie.
Hi, everybody. This is Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters, and you're listening to the one, the only,
Mistress Carrie.
Hey, this is David from the band Disturbed, and you're listening to the baddest bitch in Boston, Mistress Carrie.
Hi, Bruce Dickinson here from Iron Maiden. Yes, indeed, Miss Whiplash herself, Mistress Carrie, is here to unchain your brain.
Hi, this is Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. You're listening to Mistress Carrie.
This is Dennis Leary. You are listening to my favorite, Mistress Carrie.
Hey, this is Corey from Stone Sour, and you have the privilege of listening to Mistress Carrie. Oh, God. Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, I can't believe I'm talking to Nancy Wilson. Oh my God, welcome to the show, Nancy Wilson.
Hey, wow, I'm glad to be here, especially now with that introduction.
Oh, holy shit. Being a woman in rock and roll for me, almost 30 years, there is a list of women that have been on my bucket list to interview, and I am making a giant check mark today with you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Just cross that one right off.
I'm crossing you off, although that doesn't mean you can never come back.
Right. Well, we're really happy to be here. It's a good show, too, and I love your background.
Oh, welcome to MCHQ. This is my own personal studio now. Much like you during the lockdown, I had to get creative to continue my career. And you got your solo album, You and Me, and I got MCHQ.
All right. Well, it's all good. It looks really cool, and what you're wearing is really cool too. So,
well, it's summertime. You gotta just put the tank on and just let the girls breathe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know what you mean. Yep.
There's so many things that I want to talk to you about, but I guess we should start at the beginning. You are a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee with the band Heart with your sister Ann Wilson. You are legends in rock and roll, and you are one of many plaques on the wall that Seattle kind of gets to brag about with all the amazing music that comes out of there.
Oh, Seattle. I love Seattle. I miss Seattle a lot, but I've, family and friends. My family used to all be there, but still some family there and a bunch of, cool buddies still that live there. So mainly my band that played on, with Heart on the last big Heart tour and on my solo album all live in Seattle too. So yeah, we're going to do a show there pretty soon. So it'll be really a homecoming for sure.
You grow up in a city that now is so synonymous with music, obviously between Heart and Hendrix and grunge. People think immediately Seattle. When you and Ann were growing up, what were you guys listening to?
Well, our family was really musical. We always had a good sound system and a reel-to-reel, tape recorder our parents were kind of audiophiles, and they recorded onto tape a bunch of the albums that they played so that they'd be protected. They'd still have an extra copy of backup if record ever got scratched. So we had Ray Charles, we had Aretha, who's also from Seattle. We had Aretha Franklin, Judy Garland, Barbra Streisand, classical, not too much jazz really, but a lot of blues. And we were steeped in all kinds of killer stuff, even like big bombastic classical stuff, and famous composers, and a lot of singing along going on in the house.
It comes up a lot on the podcast that you get exposed to music by older siblings, parents, cool aunts and uncles. Then there's a time when you decide this is now my music. And there's the seminal album or artist that kind of you gravitate to and say, this is mine now. What was that music for you?
Well, it absolutely was the Beatles. I mean, we saw them when they kind of descended on the planet on the, in 62, I think it was, on the Ed Sullivan Show. And it was like a lunar landing was happening. It was like the lunar landing. It was, nobody was not watching. It was an appointment television. It was an appointment concert, and they changed the face of everything, the face of culture and music. So we had to have guitars immediately. We wanted to be them, not marry them, but be the Beatles. And so we made, we pleaded for guitars, and we got guitars, and we made bands with girls from the choir that we could sing with. And, we just started immediately learning the craft so that we could be the Beatles and learn every Beatles song, every top 40 song from the radio, basically. And started playing out in, schools and churches and even a drive-in theater at one point. We just had to be in a band. We had to make bands, and they all had really kind of bad names, like the Rapunzel, or the Viewpoints, or the Mode. Well, that was not so bad, but the Mode was kind of a cool name. But then there was Depeche Mode later. The Electric Prunes was one of our band names.
That would have been unfortunate.
Right. Well, when you're really a kid, I mean, I was 9 when I played guitar. I started playing guitar. So it was really kind of an in-group joke. Everything was always an in-group joke with us.
It's a huge, important distinction, what you just said, that you didn't want to be with the Beatles, like the throngs of screaming girls around the world. You and Anne wanted to be the Beatles. What was it about your upbringing that created that distinction? Because at that time, a girl rock and roll group, not the 50s doo-wop singers and that kind of stuff, but the concept of a girl rock and roll group, that's not exactly the obvious answer. Where did that gumption come from?
I think because we were starting young enough before we had like a sexual identity or constraints, around our thinking about it, that we had so much music in our history of our family and singing along, all kinds of sing-alongs and harmony singing and old pub songs and ukuleles and, beach fires and singing harmonies. And so we knew we had, the skill set to be able to take it further. So it wasn't a big, leap from just being in a musical family to making music in a band. And, and girls were kind of easier to kind of hang out with. So we just brought girlfriends from the choir in, and we were always a foursome, like the Beatles. We got to go see the Beatles at the Seattle Center in 1966 when they came through there. And we arrived at the show in our costumes that were matching Beatle costumes to the Beatles' actual.
This is the greatest story ever, Nancy. Greatest story ever.
Except our mom made the outfits for us. Except we had skirts instead of slacks, and we had kind of our Beatle boots and nylons and the mandarin jackets with military buttons and the high collars, and so we had our. We didn't scream. We made not one sound. Everyone else, of course, it was pandemonium, and you could kind of hear the Beatles play, but we were just like taking notes, through our opera glasses, our binoculars, just like studying. This was the master class, we were studying everything they were doing and taking dictation.
I got to see Paul McCartney. Obviously, I never got to see the Beatles, but I got to see Paul McCartney as the halftime show performer at the Super Bowl some years back. And I just remember sitting there going, I'm watching a fucking Beatle. Like, yeah, right. Did you ever get a chance in all your travels and all the time that you've been successful as a musician to actually talk to any of the Beatles as a peer?
Sort of. I got to talk to Paul about 3 different times before his couple of shows that I went to see. One was with Wings, and then it was his newer band, the Paul McCartney Show, I guess. And he's exactly the guy you want him to be. He's really generous and sweet, and there's no pretense with Paul McCartney. He's just a good person. And he's kind of, he's an upbeat guy. And, for all the stuff he's had to live through, that's pretty impressive to me because, losing John, losing Linda all along the way, and continuing to just, push forward with all his optimism and his beautiful talent. And the new album he just did was really cool too. I mean, he's really, and then we just saw this incredible documentary with Rick Rubin called
Isn't it amazing? I loved it.
Yeah. It's like a million, trillion thrills. And, even if you don't know the Beatles very well, it's another masterclass, in melody and structure, songwriting, writing it, singing it, playing it, all the stuff he does so well. He's a master.
You know what I took from that more than anything? Because my mother gave me the gift of not only my love of music, but my love of the Beatles. And that was the soundtrack in my house. So hearing you talk about loving the Beatles, I'm the same way. And what struck me the most out of that Rick Rubin miniseries was when they broke down the flavors that John Lennon and Paul McCartney brought to the songwriting, about how Paul McCartney was more positive, whereas John Lennon was more cynical, and tied it to their upbringing and how their family structure was. It blew my mind and changed everything for me.
And as a songwriting team, that was one of the things Paul talks about quite frequently in his interviews, where John's kind of cynicism would sort of temper and balance out his gung-ho sort of positive melodic thing, that he was so good at. And so John would kind of, put the darkness into the lightness and create, the art, darkness and light.
I just never tied it to their family structure and upbringing. And so that was so enlightening for me that it would have that much influence on your art in that way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly John Lennon's father was a real ne'er-do-well. We called him Ignoble Alfred. And he was always missing and kind of a cad of a sailor guy. And so, John had a lot of pain, and both John and Paul had lost their moms. In their young sort of teenage era of their lives. So they had a lot to connect to. But I think with Paul, his family was much more, happy-go-lucky and musical and, supportive. And John was more of a lonely kid with a chip on his shoulder. So that, that really rounded out the equation of the two of them as artists.
You talk about the musical family that you and Anne grew up in. And recently I had a chance to talk to Dean DeLeo from Stone Temple Pilots. And I was kind of joking on myself that I chose poorly growing up on the instrument that I learned because I grew up playing the clarinet, which is not exactly the smartest choice when you're a rock fan. And I know your sister plays the flute, which isn't, other than Jethro Tull, a real rock and roll instrument.
Well, she tried to learn trumpet in school at first in band. And somebody, I think the instructor said, that's not a girl's instrument. You should play the flute because that's a girl's instrument. And, she'd also chipped her tooth on the trumpet because our sister Lynn was pulling at it, trying to get it away from her, probably because it was noisy or something. And she let go and it chipped her tooth. So then she got the tooth fixed and she picked up the flute. I tried to pick up the flute and I tried some clarinet for a while too. And, getting the embouchure thing down was really difficult for me. But I love the sound of clarinets and, obviously so does Paul McCartney. So there's a place for clarinet,
Yeah, it's just so much cooler to play guitar, Nancy.
Yes, well, yeah, you can't really slouch with a clarinet correctly, it has to be slouchy with a rock and roll kind of instrument like the guitar. You have to sling it low and slouch with it.
Do you still have the first guitar that you ever played?
No, it was such a piece of rubbish. I mean, I got rid of it. I gave it away or something. I should have burned it because it was unplayable. there was no barring an F chord, or, you could ever manage to do on that guitar. The bridge was not fixed down, so it was going out of tune all the time. So I'd move the bridge a little just to kind of try to keep it more in tune as I played it. But I learned how to get strong on that guitar because it was so terribly, it was like a piece of plywood with a, with a pipe for a neck. But then I got a good one.
Did you take formal lessons? I'm really curious. Are you a musical note reader? Do you learn from ear? Do you play from feel? Where did it come from?
Well, there were some piano lessons along the way because her mom was a great pianist. And so we got some basic sort of reading experience like that. But when I picked up the guitar, it was only by ear from there out because just a couple of chords from the Mel Bay chord book, and you're off and running. And I could just pick stuff out by ear. And, I couldn't be bothered to stop and to remember how to read music. Even though I've done score music for film and all that kind of stuff, I just go by ear. And then, I can hear stuff in my head and then I can put it onto tape, or into, into a recording. And it's just, I think, something when I went to college for a little while and I went to study music theory, the reading part was the hardest part for me, but the students of the music theory class, a lot of those were really, accomplished piano players that had been trained and read really beautifully, like reading music. But they said, how do you just play without a piece of music in front of you? Like, how do you do that? It was like, they didn't understand that you can play without reading the music. So it was a really interesting, I could have written a thesis about it really, because, when you're dependent on reading a piece of music and you can't improvise or play by ear or just, pick out a melody for even like, row, row, row your boat without reading it, it's an interesting dilemma in music theory where people can't sort of have it both ways,
Do you remember either the first song that you ever wrote on the guitar or the first song you ever learned? Do you remember what it was?
I think it was probably a Beatles song for sure, because picking up the chord for anything that we could remotely call it, like, this sounds familiar, this must be that Beatles song. Yeah, specific song, I don't remember. We learned a whole bunch of songs all at once. So we had to learn the association stuff. We had to learn, everything on the radio, the Turtles and the Doors and the Beatles and the Moody Blues and just everything. So we could just sit around and play songs with our friends and just be like jukeboxes all day long.
What about when you change from the acoustic guitar and get your hands on an electric guitar for the first time?
Somebody gave me an electric guitar that they'd made out of parts when I was just still a really new player. And we had a little amp and played a little bit of bass as well. So and we did a lot of recordings, sort of comedy recordings, like joking around with songs like Scotch and Soda. And so I would play like a mock, electric jazz solo on the electric and put some, echo on there. And so we were just like goofing around all the time with electric and acoustic and some flute parts, and I started learning blues harp, some harmonica, bluesy stuff, and we just had a blast with that reel-to-reel tape recorder. It was just a 2-track, but we used to bounce stuff over onto one, so we could have like basically 4 tracks to play around with, and we'd speed it up, twice as fast and record it that way, slow it back down to norm. It would sound like Munchkins. We had all that stuff going on. It was pretty great. And I still have backups of all the comedy music that we did on disc and on hard drive because it's classic and it's priceless. It's still pretty funny today.
I've read some science on musical ability, and there's a theory that it is the same part of the brain that has proficiency for mathematics and language. Does that describe you accurately?
Well, I'm not very good at math. I learned one language pretty well, which was German in high school and college, because the Beatles sang in German, of course, that's why. But I mean, mathematically, I understand where the structure of music is inside the accents of the bar line, the structure inside a song. It's very mathematical when you want to like count to 4, count to 8, put accents into those bar structures. And so it's more like a physically, it's a physically palpable kind of mathematics that your body feels because it's rhythm. And, if you got rhythm, you got math.
A lot of guitar players, once they go from maybe learning acoustic a little bit, and then they get their hands on the heavy metal, on the electric guitar, the acoustic kind of becomes a hobby thing that they do at home when they're working out song ideas. But you, right, unlike a lot of guitar players, continued to keep the acoustic as part of your sound. Can you talk to me about the two different flavors of the acoustic versus the electric?
Yeah, the electric it's like a different instrument to me. I mean, it's a whole different feel, and it's, you can bend way more and you can do a lot of different things that the acoustic doesn't really allow you to do. But the acoustic, in my book, the acoustic is kind of like a rhythm instrument. It's like a percussion instrument because I play it kind of aggressively. I don't play it like a little folk chick, would play a folky guitar player.
That beatnik, acoustic, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little more. I approach it a little more with a rock sensibility and definitely a percussion instrument in my way of playing. But I think acoustic can be so expressive that way because you have a lot of leeway for dynamics on it. You can you beat on it and then you can let it ring, and so you can really speak with the acoustic in a different way than you can with an electric. Electrics are really powerful. There's just nothing like playing something like Barracuda on a big stage, because it's just like screams, and it's larger than life, and it's you kind of I get a real sense of being a burly person when I'm playing a big electric guitar. I feel so burly, and I feel like Rosie the Riveter kind of, like muscular and
well, a lot of jokes have been made because when you see guys doing guitar solos, it's like they're out there like wielding a giant penis, which is just not what you can do.
Well, I have a couple of good stage moves, and one of them is the squat, where I put the guitar in between my legs and I'm squatting down and like aiming it at the crowd, because I think it's kind of it is a phallic symbol and it's a sexy thing, and it's okay for a girl to, I wouldn't do the thing where like some guys pretend it's a machine gun. I would never do that, but I would kind of, I'd dance with the electric a lot, and it's very, it's just really satisfying. It's so powerful. You feel like you can sort of conquer the day.
The road of rock and roll is paved with horror stories of brothers I mean, there's so many stories of brothers that get into bands and then they get into fights and they break up and Christmas is ruined. There are not a lot of stories about, obviously, sisters in rock and roll,
really careful
which
with.
is one of the things that makes Heart so amazing.
Because it's been a lot of decades,
but was
and
there
there have
ever
been some
a fear
falling
at
outs
one
and some
point that you guys were just going to destroy
some
the family?
challenges and trying to be a co-leader of a big metal horse like a band like Heart. You know, we can disagree. We have to agree to disagree at times and hear each other out and have a conversation about what it is, you know, I want this, but you don't want that. And I want what I want but you don't want what I want. So it's always a dance, you know, that you do, but with a couple of decent skills of knowing how to communicate with somebody you don't agree with, which I think women are much more apt to do well, then you're more likely to succeed, you know, in continuing to survive through the ups and the downs and the darks and the lights and the struggle, the power struggle of that. And, you know, like there's just some big issues that you have to face and figure out and compromise with. So I think any communication challenge with humans in general really just requires a lot of compromise and wisdom.
I've asked this question of a lot of male musicians. Is it harder to keep a band together or a marriage together? And I'm curious what your answer to that is.
Wow, that's a pretty great question. I think it's easier to keep a marriage together in many ways than a band, though marriages can, you know, be problematic too. Depends on the marriage, it depends on the band. But in our case, you know, our band has had a lot of different lineups along the way. Me and Ann are the one constant, you know, so far so good. And yeah, I think there's a lot of ego stuff, and there's a lot of, when you're exhausted and you're touring all the time and you're living in each other's pockets basically, and things can start bugging you, you know, and then it gets kind of political, and then you kind of shape shift it all over again and try it again different ways.
I read that article, the interview that you gave about back in the day when you and your sister were there with the Van Halen brothers, and it was this weird thing backstage. And all that came to my mind is, oh my God, if the Wilson sisters and the Van Halen brothers ended up together, that's like the Ghostbusters crossing of the streams moment. You guys would have had these mutant rock and roll kids that would have taken over the world.
Oh my God, that's really hysterical. Well, you know, Valerie was in the picture at the time. He was so sweet, though. He was really a great person. Those guys were all just, you know, just on fire with the partying and stuff. We were the ones that were kind of like, wow, you know, what is that you're drinking here in this bar? And it's like, this is called a kamikaze. Why don't you try one? And so we had our first kamikazes, you know, with the brothers and those guys. And it was really quite a time, you know. They were up all night quite frequently, I gotta say.
The idea that you could, I mean, everybody talks about Eddie Van Halen, especially suffering his loss almost a year ago now. And they talk about, you know, what the world was like before Eddie Van Halen. And then obviously after Eddie Van Halen, you were playing the guitar. So when you get exposed to Eddie Van Halen doing something so differently, what was going through your mind when you saw him play for the first time?
Oh my God. I mean, it was the same thing everybody was experiencing when they saw him play. It was it was otherworldly. It was unbelievable. It was, you know, nothing like it had ever happened before in the world of rock and roll or since. I mean, there's a lot of guitar players were just like, okay, I quit. I'm not going to quit, you know, because it's just like unbelievably. One of the things about Eddie's playing that was so different too was that not just his, hammering on and all the stuff he invented, but the fact that he played always in such a major, not minor, but a major key, not a bluesy kind of solo key, but soloing in major keys. So, and chord progressions that were major chord progressions. And that set him apart from a lot of the bluesier, type players that a lot of rock comes from the blues. And I think he was fresh. It was a fresher sound as well because he was also in a major key most of the time. And so when I tried to write this, dedicate this song for Edward for him from the solo album, I realized when I watched a bunch of his stuff that this is all pretty major stuff, major key stuff. And so that was my first clue how to start, because I couldn't figure out how to even start for a long time. I'd painted myself into the worst corner by saying I was going to dedicate a instrumental piece to Eddie Van Halen. And then I actually had to do it, which was not
Talk
an
about
easy
setting
task.
yourself up, Nancy.
Yeah, right? I know. I do enjoy challenges, but this was a biggie.
I've been very fortunate to interview a lot of guitar players over the years, and shortly after we lost Eddie Van Halen, I talked to Nuno Bettencourt, and we had a really in-depth conversation about where guitar tone comes from. And he told me a story about how he got invited to a Van Halen rehearsal, and Eddie invited him to play his guitar on his rig with all of his pedals, and Nuno was so disappointed that even though he was playing through Eddie's stuff, that he still sounded like Nuno. And so I want to ask you, because you have a very specific and recognizable guitar tone, and I'm curious, is it something that you try to formulate, or is it something that just comes out of your style of playing?
Well, I that's a really amazing story. Nuno is such a good friend. Love that Nuno. But yeah, we've done some stuff together too. But he's kind of right. I mean, it's really the true thing that if you play with your own style, that's not going to be the same as it's going to sound different from somebody else's playing. It's all in the expression of how you play. And, there's a lot of players you can tell who they are because of their stylistic imprint on the guitar. And, like David Gilmour is one of my all-time muses in that way because, his figures and his shapes that he's and his melodic content, the way he plays, he's just his own player and nobody else is going to sound like David Gilmour. So it's kind of a cool thing about guitar players. They have their way of playing. When you can distinguish one person among many, that's a good player, I think.
Well, you said it recently when you were talking about your sister's voice, that it's kind of the same thing. Someone's style and guitar tone is as specific as a vocalist, and people could try to sound like Anne, but they're just not going to.
Yeah, it's sort of a fingerprint thing, it's very, even with a singer, of course, more so, because of the specific, particular, granular thing about the singer's voice. The grain of the voice itself is just skin. It's that person's skin. And their vowels and the way they say the words and how they speak the lyrics, or don't exactly sing every note, or they speak the note, speak sometimes. She gave me a really good piece of advice as a singer once that I've taken really to heart. No pun intended. But she said one time she could tell I was kind of struggling with a singing part in the studio. She said, "Don't try to be perfect. Just tell the story." And when I was singing on my new album, because I was singing everything basically, I really thought about that again, and it was really helpful to me to just be a storyteller in the context of these songs, the new ones and the covers,
Well, rock and roll, I think, is a very distinctive thing where it's almost an art form of imperfections. That it's the imperfections that are what make it so special.
Especially these days when so much music has been for so long now has been kind of perfected and auto-tuned and digitized and out of recognition in many cases, since they don't know who the singer is.
So when you're working on this solo album, You and Me, there's some songs on there that are original, like For Edward, that are in tribute to Eddie Van Halen. But then you decided to tackle some very famous songs by other artists, and you bring your own vocal styling and your own guitar tone into it. But when you're going to cover a song that's already famous in its own right, like, say, Pearl Jam Daughter, what are you thinking about when you're saying, I'm going to make that song my own somehow? How do you go into that process?
Well, in a case of a song like Daughter, it's interesting to, sometimes when you change the gender, it really takes a new turn and it makes a new statement altogether. And it's a perspective that you hadn't thought of about a song like that before. Also, that was I recorded that one specifically for a film before I even started my album, called I Am All Girls, which is a true story about human trafficking, a real true story. It's a great film. It's on Netflix right now. It's called I Am All Girls, and that's what the song's in. But because it talks about, one of the lines was she holds the hand that holds her down, and it was quite perfect for the subject of the film. But with the Dreams song, the Cranberries song, I thought, oh, this is perfect for Liv Warfield to come and do a duet with me, because it's got harmony all the way through. I just happened to hear it on the radio kind of recently. It was like, wow, what a perfect new way to do that with Liv, like in a new sort of frame, a whole new frame for a song like that. Not quite so Irish. And there was like the yodeling part of in the section of the song where she goes, whatever. And Liv is so funny. She goes, do we have to do the yodel part? Do we have to yodel? And I was like, no, we don't have to yodel. I'll put a mandolin in there. So don't worry, we're not yodeling on this song. But, and then The Rising was the first thing I really wanted to try to cover, because I'd seen Springsteen on Broadway, and it was so amazing to see songs like that and other songs that I knew these songs from the radio times, but in the stripped down way that he was doing them on Broadway, they were so significantly more heavy, and the lyric content of the songs were so deep, so much deeper without all the production around. So I figured, because of the pandemic, I would try to cover something really aspirational that would help people through this horrific thing that we were all going through, and all the fear and all the loss and everything. And it's got a real biblical, it's got a biblical structure to it that kind of, I think, could be helpful to people going through what we've all been going through for a year and a half, and apparently still are going through for hopefully not much longer.
There's also a song on the album dedicated to Lane Staley, and your relationship and connection to the Seattle music scene. I mean, when you think about, especially of that era of Seattle music, Lane Staley and Alice in Chains, and that voice is like the sound of the city.
Oh, it's really the sound of Seattle. There's a rock and roll accent that came out of the 90s, like Lane Staley's voice and Eddie Vedder's voice and Chris Cornell's voice and a lot of those guys. They had a specific Seattle accent going on. When I was working on the Almost Famous film, working on Stillwater songs, the rock band in the movie Stillwater, the last thing I needed to find was the singer. And so I tried out a few Seattle singers, but they all had the rock and roll Seattle accent, and it was wrong for the era the film was set to, right? It was like a late 70s film. So the era of that style of singing was more like what Chris Robinson would sound like, different accent altogether. And so I found a guy, Marty Fredrickson, who was like one of those kind of exact type of singers with that exact kind of an accent from that exact era of music. It was really an interesting lesson, to come around to figuring that out, because stylistically, you can mark an era by the rock and roll accent of the time.
The fact that they're celebrating such a huge anniversary for that film now, albeit a little late because of COVID or whatever, but that they're going to be re-releasing this director's cut. I've seen some of the extra minutes of the film, including the Stairway to Heaven scene in the living room that got cut out, and I'm watching it going, why did they cut this out? It was amazing.
It was really funny. It was so funny. I think they left it in as an extra, like an Easter egg extra thing, but you would have to start the song at the top of the scene to be able to see it at home without having to pay for it in the film, which was, $1 million, to pay Led Zeppelin for that song. And it would be worse. It would be higher now today.
I'm sure.
But, anyway, but it was such a funny scene. I'm glad that it wound up in the redo.
That song is so synonymous with you now and with your sister and the band because of the tribute at the Kennedy Center Honors. And they announced just this week that they're going to have a Kennedy Center Honors coming up in December. They're bringing it back. And that version, how many times has the video from your performance gone around the internet? It seems like every 6 months it gets discovered all over again, and it just passes around the internet all over again. It's such an amazing version. Were you afraid that you guys were going to screw that up?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, it's like, yeah, no pressure, just the president, the first lady, bunch of dignitaries, and Led Zeppelin. We had one rehearsal because we were on the road elsewhere. We flew in the night before the show and had one rehearsal the night before the show. And then it was really cold in D.C. and my hands were frozen when we did the rehearsal. And so I kind of messed it up a little bit, and because it was just me starting the whole song alone. So the guys in the band were like, well, we can shadow you, don't worry. We'll play along with the shadow behind you. So I will have my hands warmed up on tomorrow, and I will play it, and I'll be fine, and I know the song, so don't worry. No shadows necessary. But it was pretty nerve-wracking to like take a really deep breath. Me and Ann walked out there, just took a deep breath, looking at each other, and I just, focus, fucking focus. Don't rush. Just be deliberate and focused. Know how it goes, and here we go. And here, 3, 2, 1, go. And it worked.
Yeah, it obviously worked. Something else that's coming up later this year, and there's always debate, and, everybody argues, are they worthy of getting in or not? It's a rock and roll Hall of Fame. Why are they putting rappers in there? What did it mean to you to get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by Chris Cornell?
That was just so extremely, bizarrely, insanely cool. I mean, he's been around our city, and but he's one of, among the cool dudes of the Seattle scene and the Seattle explosion, and one of the best singers on the planet ever. Kind of like a male version of the Ann Wilson of it all. But he was always kind of aloof, I thought, when we would be hanging out places together. He was always kind of withdrawn, and I thought maybe he was kind of, I don't know, like a cool cat and just kind of not engaging, or, kind of maybe his nose was in the air a little bit. And when he wrote that beautiful introduction into the, induction speech, and like before we'd even done that, before he even did that, we did an interview with him, and he was such a fan. He was admitting that he was such a fan of us that he could barely talk to us around Seattle. And so it kind of made me love him even more, because he was nervous about saying hi. And then he was inducting us with that incredible, induction speech that was just gorgeously crafted speech. I've seen it again a couple of times since, and it really brings tears to my eyes, especially after he, departed us, which was really unnecessary and terrible.
Yeah. There's such a focus on so much of that, because we've lost, Kurt Cobain and Lane Staley, and that sound is just so associated with the city. And when you talk about grunge, like I was ashamed to find out that there was a woman named Tina Bell that kind of helped inspire the whole genre, and I had never heard of her before. Did you meet her? Did you know her? Is there anything you can tell me about her?
Not really. We were so, off touring all the time. And when we got to be home in Seattle, we were hanging with the guys more than anybody else. We met Mia Zapata, but then she was murdered. And, Sleater Kinney were always big favorites. And, some of the girl bands, the rocker girls that were around at the time, were really cool stuff. Sleater Kinney's doing great stuff now. And they're playing out too. Carrie Brownstein, who did Portlandia, of course, has written a script for a Heart film that's really good, and we're putting it together. They're casting right now. So that looks like a film that's going to happen.
That seems like the hardest question. Who's going to play you? Like, how do you pick somebody to play you in a movie?
Right, I know. Well, somebody that knows at least how to play guitar, and with some vocal ability that at least in a scene where you can warm up in a studio, or so you can kind of make it believable. There's that. But I don't think that a real voice. I mean, you probably have to do something like they did with Bohemian Rhapsody, where you use live versions and altered sounding versions of live songs that you could then animate, with the actors, and then have the occasional real vocal, in behind the scenes kind of a situation where it kind of threads it together and makes it more believable.
Yeah, but Rami Malek didn't have Freddie Mercury looking over his shoulder. You and Ann are going to be sitting there going, "Don't screw this up, ladies."
Yeah, well, we don't have a big say per se in the way it's all goes down. But I mean, I love to be on a project like movie projects or studio work. I'm a studio dog. I like to be on a set, and so, I'll probably have a few misgivings possibly along the way. It's like, that's not my mannerism. That's not my mannerism. I don't know. It will be fun though.
I have been dying to ask you this question. I ask every songwriter that comes on the show this question, and it's a question for songwriters. Can you give me an example of a song of any genre, of any era, that you give me as an example of fantastic songwriting to the point where you wish you wrote that song, and why?
Oh God, there's so many songs I wish I'd written that it pains me that I didn't write. There's songs of some of the Joni Mitchell songs, like Ijira, Songs of Sharon. Those songs are incredibly crafted and written like nobody writes anymore. It's beautiful music, beautiful poetry, and entwining. And Elton John, some of the Elton John songs like My Father's Gun and like Come Down in Time, you know, Your Song is one of them. It's just so gorgeous. And so, you know, from the deeper part of your soul kind of stuff, where words and music, you know, words and music take you to a whole other planet, you know. And I used to lay in my bed with my headphones and listen to Tumbleweed Connection over and over and over all night long, and just be taken down that riverboat, you know, like My Father's Gun is that song. And just like escape, it's an escape from reality, and it takes you to the place you can't stop ever going forever. You know, you just have to go there. You have to live there.
Well, speaking of the Kennedy Center honors, Joni Mitchell's being honored this year.
I know that. So great. She's really worthy, to say the least. Right now she's in talks with Cameron Crowe, you know, about another project, a film project. And it's very exciting. And she's having a lot of hootenannies, I guess, at her house with Brandy Carlisle, and Elton John's showing up there, and they're all singing her songs and singing their songs and her songs, and, you know, just jamboree time at her house. And so I guess she's really fully back. She has no, you know, disabilities after her last, you know, situation. She goes, I guess she said, you know, I'm built for destruction. So I'm back.
Well, the Kennedy Centers gave you at least a little bit of a taste of working with an orchestra, and you have this big collaboration that has had to be postponed. But tell me about this live stream that you're doing with the Seattle Symphony Orchestra.
Right. On October 30th, it pushed back about a little while because we were going to live stream it, but it was going to have to be distanced. And by the time it was going to be live streamed, it would look distanced after it didn't have to be distanced. So we thought, let's pack the house out. So we're going to probably do a run of West Coast shows heading up to the Seattle Symphony show. And it's going to be some heart songs. I've got a singer to help me out. It was going to be Liv Warfield, but she got a different job. So I've picked out a Seattle singer, that we're sort of trying her out right now. But, so it'll be really cool. It'll be a lot of the new songs, a couple of really familiar heart songs, starting with just me doing For Edward on my own. The band comes out, we do some more songs. Then a string quartet comes out, and then a full orchestra comes out for the ending. So it'll be really special. And then it'll be aired as well. So if you can't make the actual show, it'll be, you know, streamable soon thereafter once it's edited and finished.
Go ahead.
It'll be really good, I think.
Before I let you go, there seems to be this momentum in rock and roll, and the term female fronted, which was so synonymous with bands with women in them for decades. And now just recently it's being recognized for almost, I mean, I've even been guilty of using it just because it was the only descriptor out there. But from your perspective, as being one of those glass ceiling shattering women, is what's happening now in rock with all of the amazing rock and roll coming from bands that just happen to have women in them now, is this what you had always hoped rock and roll would get to?
Yes, I was always hoping that more girls would be in more rock bands. In the 80s, because the MTV put everything on its ear for a long time, because of all of the, the corporateness of the music as it went through the 80s and the image making machinery in the 80s and the videos, all of that stuff, and the hair and the spandex and the corsets and, the lacy gloves and all the stuff that was going on in the 80s was unconducive for women to step forward with and be, because it was a judgmental time. You had to look the part to be a woman in the 80s, in the MTV 80s. Like when you look at, what was the band of three girls? There were like three, it was like two Nances and an Ann. There was two big, huge blonde hair girls and the drummer had huge black hair.
Not Vixen that you're talking about.
Yes, it was Vixen. But they had, you couldn't tell like the girls from the boys because they all had the same hair, the same look, the same lighting, the same posturing, So I thought it just like actually put it a little bit on pause for women to actually feel confident and come forward. And now it's happening. And I'm really happy to see that, Phoebe Bridgers and just, Amy,
Amy Lee.
Yeah. Amy Lee, just so many of these really great, brave, strong writers, singer-songwriters that are just emerging all of a sudden. And it's perfect. It's like, it's about time, you guys, come on.
Well, it's not just female musicians. I mean, I've been working in rock radio now this is my 30th year. And when you look at the artists that help to make it possible for women like me or Amy Lee or anyone to be able to be taken seriously in rock and roll, we're standing on your shoulders, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to be able to interview you, is because, there's a whole generation of women coming up now that are looking at, they're growing up looking at Hailstorm and Evanescence and the Pretty Reckless, that it's normal that the radio is flooded with bands that have women in them. But those bands had to grow up looking for their own inspiration and idols to be shown that it was possible. And the list of those artists is a lot shorter. And women like you and Ann and Joan Jett and Pat Benatar and Stevie Nicks, you were the women that made it possible for us to be where we are.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think that's, if there's anything, to feel good about, to feel proud about, like accomplish what I may have accomplished by just being there at all. That's the best part, because, it's, the culture changes very slowly in that kind of respect, as far as how much women can be, allowed, you're kind of encouraged or even allowed in a certain way to taken seriously. And so, it's just a great feeling of accomplishment if I got to be part of that, the new influx of these amazing new women that are coming out right now.
Well, it was an absolute honor and a pleasure to talk to you today, Nancy. Your album, You and Me, is available everywhere. I can't wait to see the stream with the symphony. Just way you talked about it. And I loved the Kennedy Center Honors performance so much that I can't wait to see you be able to do a whole performance with the quartet and the orchestra and other singers. I think it's just going to be really cool. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Really had a good time talking to you, and thank you so much. And more to come, right?
The next time you're in town, I want to come and see you in person, but getting to talk to you this way and have you on the show meant a lot. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Well, take care and, keep rocking.
There she is, the one and only, the legendary Nancy Wilson from Heart. If you want to find Nancy online or find out more about the band Heart, Just go to the show notes of this episode of the Mistress Carrie podcast. I put all of the links, the social media links, everything there. That's also where you're going to find the link for the corresponding playlist for this episode. Every full-length and bonus episode of the Mistress Carrie podcast comes with a corresponding playlist, so you can go back and listen to all the music that we talked about in this episode. Huge thanks once again to this episode's sponsors, Digital Federal Credit Union at dcu.org and Jumptown Skydiving at jumptown.com. Nancy Wilson's solo album, You and Me, is available right now, and I cannot wait to be able to go and see her perform live. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss anything from the Mistress Carrie podcast. New full-length episodes come out every Wednesday. Plus, every weekday, you get the Situation Report. The Sit Rep gives you all of the rock news, music headlines, and industry info in less than 5 minutes every weekday. And you can join me every Tuesday night live on my Facebook page for Cocktails in the War Room. The Mistress Carrie podcast, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network.